Of course, I just want to remind everyone who needs reminding that this year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and I think, and I'm sure you agree with me, it's a good time to reflect on those momentous years and the sacrifice made by those who served and died, as well as their families at home. Especially at this time, when veterans of the Second World War are passing from the scene very, very quickly. No. This is how the Ottawa Journal reported Canada's decision to declare war on Germany on September the 10th, 1939. You'll notice that it's very subdued. No large 4-inch headlines, but it's very serious nonetheless, because almost every Canadian adult in 1939 would have been well aware that the war to end all wars, the Great War, had concluded a mere 21 short years ago. Our Canadian Armed Forces. If you heard our talk about the First War, where there were about, in fact, I don't think I mentioned it, the CEF in the First War was about a little over 600,000 men and women. Our armed forces in the Second War, much more vast than that. Canadian Army, over 700,000 men. The Royal Canadian Navy, almost 100,000. The Royal Canadian Air Force, 222,000. And the Merchant Navy, not listed here, I've got them on the screen though, about 12,000 men and women. So well over 1 million men and women in uniform. And just a comment about my favorite topic, women in uniform. The Canadian Women's Army Corps, for the Air Force, the Women's Division, the Women's Royal Canadian Navy Service, the Wrens, and of course, there were several thousand nursing sisters and nurses who served in the Second World War. And did those women answer the call? You can see the numbers on the screen there, tens of thousands. The numbers are impressive. The government turned to women and women power because of the manpower shortages, real and imagined in all arms of the services. In 1941, we need to be reminded that the outlook for the Allies was in fact cause for concern. Recognized perhaps grudgingly in some quarters that women were capable of taking on a wide range of tasks and responsibilities that normally would have been done by men, to free up those men to serve in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or whatever. It represents a significant breakthrough for women in Canadian society, much greater than the strides that had been made during the First War. 2/3 of the women in the Army trained at Kitchener, Ontario, while almost all of the Navy Wrens at Galt. Now, just to put the Second War, I think we have to put a framework around this, and I think a lot of these events are known to anyone who has read any of the media about the end of the Second World War and some of the commemorations that have taken place in the last few years. But the fall of Hong Kong in December 41, of course, followed by the Dieppe raid in August 1942. Canadians were involved in the invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943 and the turning of the tide in the war. And of course, the D-Day invasion in June 1944, the invasion of France and the eventual release of Northwest Europe from the grip of the enemy. Canadians were very prominent in the liberation of Holland, for example, in the spring of 1945, and as most people know, are still well remembered in Holland to this day. But also, one should think about all the men who were trained in the Air Force in Canada. Canada undertook to train Commonwealth air crew. Over 100,000 were trained in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plant at a number of facilities throughout Canada. And of course, the RCAF played a very prominent role in the air war. There were some Canadians in the Battle of Britain in 1940, but of course the bombing of Germany later in the war done by the RCAF. And we can't forget the Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic and the role of the Merchant Navy in the convoys from the beginning of the war until the end. And if there is sort of a good story about Canadians in the Second World War, the war brides. Some 48,000 marriages, about 60,000 dependents in total brought to Canada in 1946 and 47 as a result of marriages, mostly in the United Kingdom. Now, individual service records where they are not. Over the years, in giving presentations, I've had all kinds of questions about where the files are. I can tell you they are not at the Canadian War Museum, nor will you find them at the Royal Canadian Legion. They are not still held by the Department of National Defence, and they are certainly not in the hands of Veterans Affairs Canada. All military records are in the custody of our National Archive, Library and Archives Canada. And if you're not familiar, it's very, very important to visit the website and look at what they have to say about military heritage. It covers Canada's military heritage from the 17th century right through to, I think there may even be information there about Canadians in Korea, but mainly the two world wars are heavily described and discussed, the kinds of records that are available, and so on and so forth. And so it's important to know that. And but what we really want to know is how do we get that file, that personal file of granddad or an uncle. And I've just done something here, and I don't know how to get out of it. Okay, we're back in action. Accessing war service records. Of course, living veterans can ask for their file. That's the easy part. And the difficulty, I suppose, it's just a simple letter to LAC from a veteran, signed by a veteran, and they'll provide a copy of the file. If the veteran has been deceased for less than 20 years, the archives will release some of the information. There is public domain information. The fact that someone served in the Royal Canadian Air Force and had a number and served in the Air Force during the war, that's public information. They'll tell you that. But they won't release very many documents, not even to a family, okay, because of third-party information and the Privacy Act. That all changes if the veteran's been deceased for more than 20 years. A lot of that privacy is just ebbs away. And so it's easier to get a file if the person has been dead for more than 20 years, and simple proof is needed. It's not very elaborate. Even a newspaper obituary is sufficient. And after that 20-year period, anybody can ask for the file. So I could ask for your Uncle George's file. It's not a problem. The war dead and those killed in action, all those files are open and available, and we're going to get to those in a little bit, okay? And now, to get a file, if you look at Library and Archives, there's a rather, it's not an elaborate process, but they will show you how you can order a personnel file of an ancestor who served in the Second World War. There are directions and a procedure that you can find on the military heritage part of the website. They also indicate that there's a form there, that the downloadable form that you fill in and mail in and ask for the file. It gets mailed to LAC, and they will, over time, provide you with the file. Now, the problem, you can ask for the whole file, or you can ask for a genealogical package, which is 60 or 70 key documents from the file. But the unfortunate part of the whole thing is that you'll wait up to a year to get the information. And since the shutdown of the archives in March, only recently have staff started looking at these things again, you're going to wait a long, long time. So for Canadian residents, there is an alternative to doing that, and that's using access to information. The Access to Information and Privacy Act, if you're a Canadian citizen, you can apply for a file. Again, we're still looking at veterans who have been dead for more than 20 years. You want the whole file. You want all of it. You want every document. So you can do it very simply. You can write to them and say that under the Access to Information and Privacy Act, you are requesting the file of this particular individual whom you've identified with a name, maybe a date of birth, certainly proof of death. They need proof of death. You want to request the entire file, and you also have to send a check for $5 to the Receiver General for Canada. And under the Act, the Archives has 30 days to produce the file. Now, you have to give them some leeway. I did put in a request in February, and I only received it a few weeks ago. They did send me an email saying, sorry, we're shut down, we're not doing any of this, and so they had to waive the 30-day limit, but I think everybody can understand that. That's not a real big issue, but it's a lot easier to get the file this way than simply applying directly to the archives using the form they provide. The access law is there for Canadians to use. You might as well use it. Now, what's going to be on the file? In the First War, for those of you who heard the First War, that collection of documents, they're called files, but really they're collections of key documents that were kept for individuals. The Second War, what you're getting is the complete file. You're getting everything that was, all the paper that was ever created for an individual. So you've got attestation and enrollment. You've got a personal history summary, much more elaborate than you would have found for the First War. The postings, the medical information, the promotions, all that is there. Oddly enough, only for the Air Force do you get a photo of the individual. The three arms of the service, we're talking Army, Navy, Air Force, kept their own types of files. They're actually quite different one to the other. And so it's important to know that. But also the RCAF file will include a lot more information about training. If someone was training to be a pilot or a navigator or whatever, a lot more information on an Air Force file. And of course, once you have that file, it will allow you to look at other records for your ancestor. But just a glance at an attestation paper here of Russell Cooper. It has his name, address, date and place of birth, occupation, marital status, religious denomination, name and address of next of kin, and so on and so forth. This was Russell's agreement to serve in the Army. Every file will have an attestation document, and those for the Air Force and the Navy vary a bit in form and detail, but essentially capture the same personal information. On the right is a medical examination, and of course a physical description, everything down to the color of his hair and his overall development. They spent a lot more time assessing volunteers in 1939 and 40 than they ever did in 1914. It's something to remember. And here's a personal history form that's found on most files. Can have a wealth of information. This is information provided by the recruit himself. The best example I've got, some years ago, I fetched my uncle's file, and he died many years ago, and my cousin really didn't know a lot about what his father did prior to knowing him as his father. But anyway, my uncle very carefully listed every job he had from the time he was about 12 years old. And so my cousin, needless to say, was quite taken with the personal information form, and that should be on most files. This, if you were here for the First War, I talked about casualty form, which recorded all the movements of a soldier. On the Second War, it's a much more elaborate form. It's got a statement of service. Sometimes it has no name at all, okay? But it's the same kind of thing. It documents every move that the soldier made from the time he volunteered and was posted for training, where and when, any transportation involved, especially transportation to England, his arrival in England, and of course, as many of you will know, the Canadian Army arrived in England in December 1939 and was there. Many of the soldiers were there for more than a few years before actually seeing any action. Lots on training, promotions, and hospitalization if needed. And it's somewhat easier in a sense to determine where your ancestor was for a couple of reasons. One, we're talking about the Army, for example. If someone was a member of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, chances are that he stayed with that one regiment for the whole war. There wasn't any kind of movement between regiments. There was some, but one can almost count on him belonging to the Royal Hamiltons throughout the war. And of course, when looking at where Canadians were involved, It's a little bit difficult when they're jumping in and out of trenches in Belgium, but it's a lot easier when you know that the Royal Winnipegs were at Hong Kong in December 41 and were defeated there, and many were killed and captured. And of course, the Dieppe raid, and then you've got the invasion of Italy and the invasion of Europe in 1944. So there's a different kind of framework for the Second World War, and that makes it somewhat easier. But anyway, point being, the files are there. They're very extensive, and using the Access to Information law, one can acquire the file. It might take a little while, more than the 30 days, but it's certainly worth taking the whole file. They will provide, until recently they were providing the file on a CD, which is kind of weird because a lot of people don't have the capability of playing a CD on their computer anymore. The last file that I ordered, they sent it to me as a download through Canada Post, e-Post, okay, which it made it very quick and very simple. Now the war dead. What's interesting here is that these files are available, for one thing. The files are for all, the war dead are considered all those who died in service from the September 10, 1939 until December 31st, 1947. Okay, important. These are open to the public for research purposes and have been for some years. And this is a death from all causes. It can be killed in action, died of wounds, missing and presumed dead, illness, suicide, or even a car accident. The files are especially valuable for those interested in family history and genealogy, and it's not necessary, you'll see in a moment, it's not necessary to order these from LAC. Ancestry has digitized a portion of the files, 60 or 70 of the most important pages for someone interested in family history or genealogy. And that is in their Canadian military collections. It can be searched by name like any other database, and it will pull up the file, and you can, like Leslie was explaining, you can download, you can save it, whatever you want to do. Now, the only trick on this is, in spite of Ancestry and LAC being very careful to select those 60 key documents, like some researchers, you might want to see the whole file, okay? So what you're seeing on Ancestry, remember, is only an excerpt, okay? And so the whole file, you'd still have to go back to LAC for the whole file. War dead, no question about giving it to you because the person has been dead for a good long time and they're war dead. Interesting, what has been selected on Ancestry, for example, the letter, you know, some of these are, they're form letters in a sense, but here's a letter explaining to a woman that's sent to next of kin, saying that, you know, we think that your son or your husband or whatever is missing and presumed dead, killed in action, that kind of thing. Now, what has been preserved, and this is something that is actually very rare for the First War, there are some, but they're very rare, but for the Second War, war dead especially, is a document that was compiled in order to administer the estate of the soldier. And doing so, they had to identify all family members. So the mother and even if they're deceased, so the mother, the father, all the siblings ages, and their address, okay? They also, for whatever reason, recorded the date of the marriage of the parents of the soldier. All in this estate document. I assume it's the kind of documentation that any lawyer would put together in trying to administer an estate of someone who's deceased. The point being that the form is absolutely wonderful if you're doing family history research. It actually tells you where those siblings were at the time that the person died, and so on. So that you will find on war dead files. Very interesting. As I mentioned first time round, it's important also to look at the Canadian Virtual War Memorial, and this especially for the Second War for some reason. So I draw your attention to it. It absorbs all the information from the Commonwealth war graves, and as I said before, it's a living memorial for those who died in service. And I call it living because you or I or anybody else can add information about an individual to the website. So I think I've got an example of the fellow I was mentioning, Russell Cooper, who joined the Army and he was killed in the war. And I'm just going to show you what's on the virtual war memorial. Somebody has come along and put in a little clipping. He was from the Brant County, and so there's a little booklet was put together on those, honoring those who died. He's there. There's a photograph of him, which is not on his file. There's also a picture of his gravestone. So somebody's added that, okay? Someone in the family's added that, or someone interested in those who died from Brant County has added that. Very, very interesting way to memorialize those who died during the war. Like, that's the Canadian Virtual War Memorial. Now, if you have an ancestor who served in the Second World War and died, who lived in the province of Manitoba or Saskatchewan, boy, we're getting specific here. In both those cases, the provinces at some point in the 80s and 90s decided to name a geographic feature after every veteran from their province who died in the war. And so both provinces put together books where they tell the stories of these men, and in some cases women, who died during the war from whatever cause, and they've named something for them. In this case here, Alexander Kozak, there's Kozak Island named for him near North Knife Lake. Or Rudolph Ruck is now Ruck Lake. Herbert Morrison is now Morrison Lake. Now, you can imagine the problem they might have when they get to a name like Smith. So there's Smith Creek and there's Smith Hill and this kind of thing. But for anybody researching Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Second World War dead, it's a marvelous resource. It's very unique. I wish every province had done the same thing. But we better look at war diaries. I mentioned these for the First War. For the Second War, they're much more detailed. And there's two items here. There's the war diaries that the Army kept, and there's operations record books, or ORBs, that the Air Force kept. It's a diary, so it's a narrative of daily activities. There are daily orders attached, operational orders, so you get an overview in the narrative, and then you get more detail in some of the operational orders. There's a return of officers, and most diaries include a return of the officers who are in that particular regiment. Some of them have communication logs, okay, so you can see the to and from. Excellent stuff on keeping in touch with the soldiers who are actually doing the fighting. It's very interesting. Some of them, of course, because especially in England, where they were stationary for a year or two, there's a lot of social news. In fact, some of the units in Canada, for example, the Air Force, the operation record books for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, and every one of those facilities in Canada kept a diary. Because they were stationary, the staff were regular. There was a permanent staff on a lot of these sites. They actually developed little newsletters and newspapers and had much more interaction with the local community. And a lot of that is reflected in the diary. So it's very important to know about these things. The other thing about the ORBs for the Air Force is that they include information not found on a service record. And I'm going to show you that in a moment, but I wanted to show you a war diary and just give you a brief example of this. This is the 12th Field Artillery out of mainly Wellington County, and they spent 11 months at Camp Sussex in New Brunswick until the summer of 1941, when they went to Halifax and were sent on their way on the Duchess of York to England. The diarist notes that the men were cheerful and in excellent spirits, but once they got on the ship, the diarist noted that the conditions were hardly what the regiment anticipated. Nonetheless, discipline was excellent, and after all, the 12th Regiment was now going to war, and that's why the men were there. Skipping ahead to June 4th, June 1944, and D-Day, June 4th, the landing crafts are loaded, it says. The operation was postponed, as I think we all know, because of the bad weather in the English Channel. On June 5th, they hear it's a go, and of course on June 6th, there's quite a long entry about their invasion on the French coast, and they were in that first wave. Quite incredible detail to read it. It was written just some days afterwards. On June 8th, the diarist said that everyone felt we were going stronger and stronger. So very, very interesting if your ancestor was in a unit like that. And I've skipped ahead too far. I just want to stop here at this one. But not all went well. In August 1944, the 12th Field Regiment was actually attacked by the RAF. It's, what do we call it now, friendly fire. 11 were killed and over 50 were wounded. And that happens in war. It's very unfortunate. It's covered in great detail in the diary here of the 12th Field. And finally, these folks were also in Holland at the end of the war. And it's actually on the next one there. May 5th, or May 8th, 1945 rather, VE Day, the war is over. It was fairly routine for the men of the 12th Field Artillery. They paraded at 2 p.m. and then they had to listen to speeches from both Winston Churchill and King George VI. Now, what I said about operation record books for the Air Force, there is information that is not available on a service record. And that's the actual bombing raids that were done by Bomber Command. This is from 426 Squadron. I realize it's very blurry. Some of this microfilm was done years and years and years ago, and digitizing hasn't helped. But I do have the brother of my brother-in-law is actually mentioned on this page. He was a pilot, and it records on the right-hand side in some detail every raid that they made. It will explain who was in the crew. Usually they're crews of 7, and the Air Force had mixed crews. So you have maybe 3 fellows from the RCAF, a couple from the RAF, and you might have a New Zealander or Australian or even a South African, and even an American in some cases as part of the crew. On the right-hand side, they describe the raid, the target, what their bomb load was, whether they were attacked going into Germany, whether they were attacked when they were there, and so on, and how long they were in the air. They also report on what appeared to be success in their bombings and so on and so forth. But again, I want to emphasize you won't find that on the file of my brother-in-law's brother. It's just not there. You have to go to the diary of the squadron that the person was serving with. Again, very interesting. Honors and awards. There is a database at LAC. The database actually covers from about 1900, actually, all the way up to 1960. But it includes, of course, the Second World War, those who were awarded the Victoria Cross, all the way to mentioned in dispatches. There's an index there, and it will give you a reference if you happen to live in Ottawa and want to go to the archives, order the box, or you could simply go to Ancestry if you are a user, and under the Canadian Military Collections, Ancestry has digitized the images to the honors and awards. So if you were looking at someone who was a flyer, like the person I referred to, who had a Distinguished Flying Cross, it's listed there, and the citation for it is also there, and you can access those on Ancestry. The Second War, boy, there's a lot being written, a lot has been written. I think it's really important to look at histories of the war and histories of the regiment. If I had someone who served in the Black Watch or the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, there's histories of these units which would be important to look at. There's some good general histories of the war. Tim Cook, who's at the Canadian War Museum, last couple of years published a 2-volume history of the war. There are many, many histories of the war. Lots of memoirs. There's collections of letters, both online and published. A lot of biographies of not only officers, but also other ranks. People have written their memoirs. And again, the Canadian War Museum is really critical for this. And if you can't get to the War Museum, I'll show you what you can do. Veterans Affairs also has a site devoted to Remembrance and has a lot of good information about the war. If you're not familiar with the chronology, the War Museum or Veterans Affairs has a very nice summary of the war, all different aspects of it. And likewise, Legion Magazine, which is a terrific historical magazine, and it devotes a lot of its pages, a lot of its articles are Second War, and it's actually an excellent magazine. There is something else that a lot of people might not know about, and I did want to mention a project, an initiative by the Royal Canadian Legion to have each of their commands and the provinces, the country, I guess, is divided into commands, which largely are like provinces. And the commands, a number of years ago, started a project where they would recognize military service. And I'll just show you an example because they're really quite intriguing. But first of all, I just wanted to, again, remind you about the Canadian War Museum. If you're not familiar with the war, or if you have a younger person in your family who wants to get involved in this, it's really important to look at this site or the next one, the Veterans Affairs site, Remembrance, where they have an outline of the war and discuss not only the big features of the war, but also get into some of the details. And and if you're not interested in looking at a book, these websites are actually terrific. And as I said, Legion Magazine has a number of articles online and the magazine itself, which is really terrific. A source that's less likely to be known are these Royal Canadian Legion military service recognition books. There are over 90 volumes in total when you add up the different commands. As far as I can tell, all of them are online and searchable. They are dependent on local submissions, so it's people in the area or people who belong to a particular branch of the Legion to submit an entry. Some even date from the War of 1812. I've seen some that date that far back where someone's prepared a little biography of a great-great-great-grandfather who served in the War of 1812, and it goes in the book because they are recognizing military service. They are dependent on advertising, which appears on every second page, but the volumes are indexed. In fact, Ontario has a master index on its website for all its volumes. And some volumes include stories and reminiscences. People have added additional information. There's the Ontario Command, and you can see that the biographies, some of them are on the, it's more than just tombstone information. There's actually a little story there. I have seen in Saskatchewan, there was a story about a war bride and her husband, and so on and so forth. So they vary from one province to the other, but they follow this format where people have contributed their own personal stories of their grandfather, their father, or themselves, actually. Now, the only advantage of the Second World War is we can now watch the war. The National Film Board has a War, Conflict, and Peace section with some World War II archival films, but also on Library and Archives Canada under Newsreels, not a very sexy title. Also, the War Amps of Canada have the Canadian Army newsreels. These are the official Army newsreels that were created during the war. Absolutely wonderful to watch. And there is an index of sorts. It will certainly give you an idea of what you're watching. And of course, there is the sound. These were newsreels that were shown in movie theaters during the 40s, and they are all available, the official Army newsreels. The National Film Board is something more than that. These are commissioned films that they did on aspects of the Second World War. So just a reminder, and this would go for any kind of military research that you're doing, whether it's First War, Second War, or some of the events that Leslie mentioned in the first hour, it's important to, and now I'm stuck, oh yes, personal knowledge. It's important, of course, a lot of people have personal knowledge that dad or granddad or that famous great Uncle George was in uniform at one time. So there's some family lore attached to all this. Sometimes families have documents I have my grandfather's discharge certificate from the First War. Other people have a lot more than that, photographs, diaries, and so on. And that's important to have photographs. Lots of people have them from the Second World War. It was a lot easier to take photographs. And of course, some people have artifacts. It could be metal, could be a piece of uniform even, wouldn't surprise me. This kind of thing will not only generate interest, but sort of give a sense of it, and it's worth pursuing. So I'm asking you to remember that ancestor service file and getting a copy of it and starting there. You can determine the nature of the service. It will become clear, for example, in an RCAF file, whether the person was a pilot, a bomber, a navigator, or whatever. And of course, it will tell you the unit, the squadron in case of the Air Force. In the Army, you're going to know exactly where your ancestor was, who he was serving with. Lots of online research can be done, a lot of published resources, lots of good online material, as I pointed out. And of course, this allows you to look at archival records. There's more than just a service file and a war diary. There are a lot of records relating to the Second World War. For many years, the Directorate of History and Heritage at National Defense have produced histories of the war. And of course, the material that they accumulated in the course of this research, most of it is now at Library and Archives Canada, very detailed military records, but for someone who really wants to get into it, there's a lot more than a service file or a war diary. And so I think what I'm going to do is sign off and say thank you. And I'm going to leave you with Leslie's email if you have a question, and my own email if you have a question. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope that you take something away from this that you can use in your own research. Thank you very much.
One is just a general comment that one of our watchers said she requested a file from LAC in November 2018, did not receive anything, and a few weeks ago she did receive notice that she was still in the queue. So I'm not sure how that's going to work, and I do think that's interesting.
Is she there,
Yeah,
Nick?
she's online now.
Yeah, I would I would spend the $5, ma'am, and do an I assume you're a Canadian citizen, and do an access to information request, and it's only going to cost you $5. And like I said, there is a 30-day limit, and the limit doesn't apply right now because of the shutdown. But I know they are working. A few weeks ago, I said I did receive a file I ordered in February. I actually received the file on a Sunday afternoon. Someone was working, and I wrote back to the woman and I said, when I worked at LAC, we never worked on a Sunday. And she said, well, we've got a lot of files to get out, and that's what I'm doing. And so I would turn around. If they're making you wait that long, I'd do an access to information request.
Yeah, she agreed with that point. The next question, so with access to information, you said 60 key documents. If we want the whole file, would we still be able to get it through access to information, or is it just through LAC?
These are war dead files.
Yeah.
Okay, so the files, the images, the documents themselves are on Ancestry, and like Leslie and I have said, there's about 60 documents, key documents. If you want the whole file of a person who died during the Second World War, it would be a matter of, unfortunately, you could either write to LAC and then wait for it, or you could put down the $5 and write in and say, well, I'm interested in the entire file of my great-uncle George. You could even say, well, I know that some of it's available on Ancestry, but I'd like to see the whole file, please. And it'd certainly be worth the investment.
And then finally, the Royal Canadian Legion recognition books, are the write-ups only for the dead of a given date?
Oh, no, I should have mentioned that. No, it's what's interesting is that people have compiled them for a father who died in 1990, and they thought, well, okay, I'll write up that he was in the war and this is what he did, and I'll put it in this book. I should have mentioned that. Yes, it's not just war dead. It's people who died long after the war. And it's a very interesting project. It's ongoing, apparently. And like I said, there's more than 90 volumes available from different commands or different provinces across Canada.
Yep.
Yeah.
At Beechwood in our library, we do hold the Ontario ones
Oh, very good.
for the last few years. So I guess on that note, I'd really like to thank everyone for joining us on YouTube. Again, we'd like to thank you for sort of making the shift from in-person to online. We're experiencing this COVID all together, and it's great to at least feel like we're together and doing this research together. Again, I'd like to immensely thank Leslie Anderson from Ancestry.ca for that wonderful presentation, and Glenn Wright as well, who has a lot of accreditations on himself and a lot of experience in this wonderful field of historical research. We are hoping to host more of these in the future with people in our room when COVID permits, but again, keep an eye on the Beechwood website because we'll definitely have some updates there. I can't express how much it was great to have you guys online with us today. Again, thank you.